of course, Canadians, and many of them listening, would be appalled that we're talking so flippantly about their national sovereignty. But, we shall see. Canada has its own political crisis unfolding, as I'm sure you know. The benefit would be obvious. You get an enormous influx of resource. You get access to the Arctic, by the way, which is becoming more strategic. If you look at the globe, not with the North America in the center of it, but with the North Pole at the center of it, you suddenly realize the strategic importance of Greenland vis-a-vis Russia and Europe. I don't think that this is a joke. I don't think he's trolling. He has a way of negotiating, and perhaps sovereignty won't change, but agreements between entities might be rewritten in far more in America's favor. But I would take it very seriously. If I lived in those places, I would not think that Trump is joking.
You're watching Capital Cause, and my name is Danny, and today's guest is Doomberg. Doomberg, thanks for coming back on, my friend.
Danny, always happy to join you. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, all that jazz.
Yeah, definitely. Let's dive right in, Doomberg. What is the top story on your radar screen at the moment? What do you want to talk about?
Well, interesting. It's not something we've written about yet, but it's something we've talked about on a few podcasts. But I think the top story is the transition of the U.S. president. I mean, I just think it goes without saying. Whether that happens, I think far too people are taking that as a fait accompli. Whether there is a smooth transition of power on January 20th is sort of the top of our analysis tree. And then what happens after, if Trump does take office? I think people are very much misreading the current situation in Washington for reasons we can get into. We've developed our own mental model internally to try to read what's going on in DC. It seems to fit the facts better. And obviously, no other topic, be it war or peace or energy or stocks or bonds and interest rates, can really be game planned out until we know for sure who's going to be the president come January 20th. And I know for some listeners that might sound weird to say, but 2024 has been anything if not but very weird. And so it's kind of like the old saying in investment banking, the deal hasn't closed until the check clears or till the wire clears. Trump is not president until he's sworn in on the 20th. And there's lots of ways actually that could get disrupted. So that's the main story. I think all other stories are derivative of that one. And so that's the one we're keeping closest attention to today.
How could it get disrupted?
Well, there are already 2 attempts on his life, for one. And, let's pray that there isn't a third. But we would note with some curiosity the relative lack of curiosity on the part of the mainstream media as to the details behind those attempts on then former president, now President-elect Trump's life. That's obviously one way. But there's a black swan way as well, which people have been talking about sort of offline and whispering to each other, which is this whole perceived squabble over the Speaker of the House. If the Republicans can't get their act together and elect a Speaker, and they are basically deadlocked, the House can't really be called into session. And if it can't be called into session, it can't certify the election results. That's just one.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I'll let you finish. Go ahead.
Sure. I think you were going to ask, has that ever happened?
Yeah.
I don't think it has, maybe in the early days when weird stuff went on, but I'm pretty sure it hasn't. But there has been extended debates over the speakership. I mean, Kevin McCarthy emerged from rounds and rounds and rounds of internal debate. And even Speaker Mike Johnson's ascension wasn't all that smooth. The narrow margin in the House of Representatives means that it won't take many Republicans to continuously defect to block the House from coming into order. And so I don't think that's going to happen. It's not our base case, but when people just assume, he will be president on January 20th, there are ways that he won't be. I highly doubt that they'll happen. I don't necessarily highly doubt that something will be tried. Look, Donald Trump is taking on very powerful people. If you go back and listen to his Agenda 47 videos from March 2023, he is behaving as though it is his intent to implement those quite literally, dismantling the deep state. And he has many, many policy vectors to do that, and he's following through on that based on his appointments and public statements since winning the Electoral College. well, the election first and then the Electoral College formally a few weeks later. So these are very powerful people. They have tools at their disposal. They have a long history of using them. I don't think they're not just going to meekishly, slip away into the night and hope all is well on the other side of January 20th. And I think, it's pretty naive to assume that they will. We don't have strong emotional ties to it. We're just trying to understand it as analysts. I think you have to understand what's going on in DC to properly understand what's going on in the world. And I think most people are getting it wrong. Maybe I'll dive into our mental model if you want.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think the big mistake everybody's making right now, and again, this is trying to be as apolitical, nonpartisan as possible, just objectively looking at the facts. The best way to think of Trump's relationship with the Republican Party is that he executed a hostile takeover of the brand and the party infrastructure, especially at the state level. The Republicans in D.C. are a separate entity than Republicans in the states, who tend to be more grassroots, more sort of authentic to conservatism, all this other stuff. Trump never and has never won the real backing of the Republicans in D.C. And in fact, we think the best way to model Washington is to assume that there's no such thing as a Democrat or a Republican, but instead there are two teams, Team D.C., Nancy Pelosi, Mitch McConnell, Chuck Schumer, Mike Johnson, Lindsey Graham, pick your favorite.
The Uniparty.
Uniparty, and then there's Team Trump. And look, all these reports that, Republicans control the House and Senate are just a wrong way to look at it. Team DC controls the House and Senate, probably by a ratio of about 85 to 15. And so, especially in the Senate, where you're elected for 6-year terms, and only some of the incoming Republicans truly owe their seats to the Trump effect in this election. Like Mitch McConnell is one of Trump's strongest opponents and most skilled opponents, although he seems to be on the Joe Biden curve of mental decline. But Team DC controls the Senate and Team DC controls the House. We saw it with the passage of the continuing resolution bill. It was, the entire DC caucus and 30 from Team Trump that opposed it. It was the Democrats and the Republicans working together to pass things that Trump was opposed to. Most notably, there was not a tackling of the debt limit issue. They didn't listen. They didn't care. They're on Team DC. So the Republicans don't exist in DC. They exist in the states, the Republican Party in Texas, and the Republican Party in Ohio. And they're like real sort of, at least much more so compared to DC, closer to sort of the Team Trump ideology. And look, you see it in the crossover vote for Trump. You had union members who would typically vote Democrat vote for Trump. They would probably tell you they weren't voting for the Republican Party. They were voting for Trump. And you had traditional sort of neocon type Republicans, Dick Cheney, most sort of famously among them, endorsing Harris for president. So I just don't think it's the correct mental model to assume, like, boy, why are the Republicans giving Trump such a hard time? They're not Republicans. They pretend to be Republicans. They have to run as though they will be conservative. And when they show up in D.C., they spend and tax like everybody else. And so it's all a bit of a facade, a bit of a play. And that's what we think is the best way to look at D.C. And then when you look at D.C. in that way, and you ponder the fact that he hasn't actually been certified as the next president, nor been sworn in yet. He has technically won the Electoral College, but that Electoral College victory has not been certified by Congress per the Constitution. That he's facing an uphill battle for that. And so today, when I see on Truth Social that, much to the chagrin of many of the sort of mega Twitter personalities, that he has endorsed Mike Johnson to be Speaker, I'm not surprised by that. He needs a clean Republican nominee that can certify the election. He could deal with all of the other challenges with getting his legislation passed after he becomes president, but not before. And so that's our view of the world. Some might find it controversial. You're happy to disagree with it, but I think it explains in a far better way the news flow that we're seeing. And, as a scientist, you develop a hypothesis and then you measure the data against it. And if the data fits, the hypothesis is good until it doesn't.
How do you bracket for the progressive leftists and within the Democratic wing, like the Bernie Sanders, the Squad, et cetera? Like, are they Team DC as well, or are they kind of like their own thing?
Well, they're so anti-Team Trump that for the purposes of this analysis, they're Team DC. If the tables were turned, they would be their own sort of wing. And so, but the broad center, so maybe it would be 15, 70, 15. a Team Bernie, Team DC, Team Trump in that order. But they're not going to be, with maybe a few exceptions. I did note with interest that, for example, Elizabeth Warren supported Trump's view on the debt ceiling limit. And there are a few, Bernie Sanders sort of made some noise about supporting the Doge team in cutting waste from government and a few other policies. So yes, it's probably slightly more complicated than that, 15-70-15. But for the purposes of this analysis, the vast majority of time, it's 85-15. And so, like, you're not going to see Bernie Sanders voting for Mike Johnson to be Speaker of the House. And so, yeah, that's our view. And then, by the way, like when we develop these models, they're just temporary. We use them to interpret the news flow. And then when we see a significant change in the news, we adjust our models.
Understood. What do you make of his pick for Secretary of State in the form of Marco Rubio? Isn't Marco Rubio like one of these establishment Republicans? What do you make of him?
Yeah, he would be on Team DC. Look, he can't pick none for his cabinet, right? And under Marco Rubio is a lot of sort of Trump loyalists. And again, it doesn't explain all of the data, but the vast majority of people that he is nominating for these positions are highly controversial. He needs a few olive branches to Team DC. He has to work with them to get stuff done, especially given the lopsided nature of the composition of Congress that I just described to you. And so, but I would say he's had 4 years to learn from what happened to him in 2016 and what happened in 2020. And he's far better prepared to avoid some of the traps that Team DC had set before. But I wouldn't read too much into Rubio. It's broadly consistent with our theory.
So Team Trump today has somewhat changed from the Team Trump of 2016 and even 2020. He has these little tech allies in Silicon Valley, namely Peter Thiel, PayPal Mafia guys, the Founders Fund guys, Elon Musk, and even some Wall Street guys as well. I believe Jamie Dimon got as close to endorsing him as possible without actually endorsing him. So what do you make of those new alliances? Are they going to water down his agenda or not? What's the nature there?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't characterize Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and David Sachs as little as the way that you did. They're quite,
the VC guys. Yeah.
They're quite powerful people, very wealthy people, and decided to collectively back Donald Trump. Who knows what backroom deals were cut? I think Trump's a deal maker. I mean, he's an ideologue in one way only, which is sort of this pro-America, Fortress America mindset. But he's quite, he has quite a track record of compromising, even sometimes on quote unquote core issues. And then the whole debate we saw over H-1B was interesting to watch from afar. And so we'll see. Yeah, there's certainly some discord within Team Trump, even as you correctly noted.
Interesting. Well, let's actually one more thing. What would you bracket the probability that he does get inaugurated?
85%.
85%.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's not our base case.
Yeah.
But it's not exactly,
That's actually pretty low. I mean, when you really think about it, I mean.
Yeah, well, we kind of view this as a merger arb, right? Well, this deal is going to close, it's going to get approved. The stock is trading at 96%. I think the probability is a little wider than most are modeling, which is the only point we're making. Again, I want to be 100% clear. We are not saying he's not going to become president or even that it's unlikely. We just think the odds of something weird happening between now and January 20th are very high, either on the domestic or geopolitical front, by the way. Lots going on in the geopolitical front that is a little weird for a presidential transition period, if we're being totally honest. The U.S. is in a very precarious place, and I think to deny otherwise is to deny reality.
Let's just dive into the geopolitical front, namely Ukraine and Russia. What do you see happening there that could potentially escalate tensions to the point where by the time Trump's in office, he may be dealing with, he may not be able to turn it back? What do you think?
Well, all depends on an important thing that you and I and everybody listening to this probably doesn't really know, which is there, and to what extent is there any real conversations going on between the outgoing foreign policy establishment and Trump's incoming team? If what we're seeing going on in the news is happening with no dialogue between the two, then we are in fact in a very, very risky situation. If there's at least consultation and even collaboration on the things that we're seeing, then that's a completely different story. I've seen no evidence that there's extensive dialogue between the two sides, and there's plenty of evidence that there is none. But you never know, right? History is written decades later, and who knows who's talking to who, and
Yeah,
so on.
but the Biden admin has not been making it easy for the Trump admin to end this war. I mean, just today they sent out another what $2.5 billion in aid. I think this
Oh,
is
yeah.
yeah.
Look, no
Go
doubt,
ahead.
but we have effectively American soldiers firing long-range missiles into old Russia. Like that, it was unthinkable 10 years ago that we would do that, let alone during the peak of the Cold War. And so that crosses a serious red line. We've seen some retaliation by the Russians, namely the launching of this new medium-range ballistic missile, whose name I can never pronounce, but apparently was quite the technological demonstration. Um, but not much more than that. I think the Kremlin is probably saying, well, we have two Americas right now, and there's a new one coming in on January 20th who is sending completely different signals. So long as we don't see anything too egregious, we will bide our time, defend ourselves, press the attack in Ukraine, and wait for Trump to come in and see if there's any serious conversations to be had. I do think the chasm between what Trump thinks he can do to get a ceasefire and what the Russians are demanding to agree to a ceasefire is pretty wide, and not sure that that's actually going to happen, or certainly not going to be as easy as this Team Trump is projecting it might be. But we're also seeing a whole rash of weird events, and who knows what's going on behind the scenes, right? We're seeing this amazing rash of plane crashes.
Hmm.
You know, this plane over Azerbaijan, which the sort of rumblings are that there may have been some Russian anti-aircraft event that participated in the downing of that plane, whether directly or indirectly. Um, the president of Azerbaijan is certainly making loud noises to that effect. We've seen this horrific crash in Korea, and then yet another plane overnight with a similar landing gear issue. We see this rough landing in Halifax, I believe it was, in Canada. This is, there's a rash of them. We've seen this sinking of this Russian flagged cargo ship in the Mediterranean, and the Russians are saying that was a terrorist attack. We've seen the cutting of the internet cables, I believe, connecting Finland and Estonia, if I'm not mistaken. And then the Finns boarded under arm a Russian cargo ship and have seized it. None of this is getting much press in the West, but it's certainly getting a lot of press in places like Europe and Russia. We're seeing all manner of just weird things. We're seeing the gas war right now flare up between Slovakia and Ukraine, and tomorrow is the last day for gas to flow through the remaining pipeline that Russian natural gas was flowing through, connecting into Serbia and Hungary and on to other countries. And so if gas completely shuts down, that actually kind of hurts Ukraine in two ways. One, they siphon a portion of that gas for their own domestic needs. That's going to be turned off now at a time where Russia has been bombarding their energy infrastructure with ballistic missiles, which we have said repeatedly and reiterate that we believe is a war crime under Article 147 of the United Nations Charter. But if Slovakia gets cut off from Russian gas because Ukraine has refused to re-up the deal, they have signaled they'll retaliate by no longer exporting electricity to Ukraine, who badly needs it, precisely because Russia has been bombarding their domestic electricity grid. And so we're seeing also sort of large and rapid movements in the favor of Russia on the battlefield. While the U.S. is surging weapons into Ukraine, you mentioned a small bit of it in your question earlier. And so there's like a lot of pieces on the board that are moving rapidly ahead of January 20th, which is why I started this whole conversation by saying the event horizon that occurs on January 20th, trying to predict what happens beyond that without knowing how that's going to go, is pretty challenging.
Do you have any thoughts on these drone sightings? I mean, they appear to be, I mean, at first thought, I mean, you would think that they would be military drones in response to something. Is this a national security issue that we're seeing, or what's your take on these drone sightings?
So, I mean, I have absolutely no idea. I note with interest that they seem to have disappeared rather rapidly. I don't see any more reports of them unless I'm missing something. I'm pretty tuned into the news. If you pushed me, sort of felt like a bit of a psyop. Let's distract everybody with 1,000 drones in the sky. I don't know for what purpose, and we never will. But if it was a true national security event, or we had truly no idea what the origins of these drones were, in my view, we would have seen a radically different response from the Pentagon. They claim to have the ability to read scratches on a license plate from outer space. Clearly, they must know where these drones are launching from, especially if they're sort of flying over sensitive areas and large population centers up and down the U.S. Atlantic coast. And so I don't know. I have no idea. I can only speculate. Doesn't feel like this was something the Pentagon and the administration knew nothing about. Why they would allow it to occur and then suddenly turn it off all at once, who knows? There's rumors, of course, that they were looking for, radioactive materials, or they were UFOs, or pick your favorite wild story. The disturbing part about our quote unquote democracy today in the U.S. is that the public is just routinely not informed about really important things like this. Like they're just going to memory hold us. It's going to go away, and nobody's ever going to investigate it.
Yeah, totally. Well, we talked about the Ukraine-Russia turmoil there. What about Syria? Syria is kind of like this connective tissue between the Ukraine-Russia conflict and the conflict in the Middle East because of the stakeholders there. Now you've got the United States, Turkey, and Israel doing their thing over there in Syria. What's going on there in Syria? I mean, is this thing about to blow up into a civil war, or what? How do you see it play out?
Hey guys, quick pause. I won't take too much of your time, but if you're looking to add into your gold and silver stack, please consider Miles Franklin. More specifically, email them, info@milesfranklin.com, and tell them that Capital Cosmos sent you in the subject line to unlock special pricing that you won't find on the website. In the unlikely event that you don't like the prices, you could always not buy. There's no commitment necessary, but I do recommend Miles Franklin for a number of reasons. The customer support is top notch, the prices are great, and I know the people there. Great people all around. So with all that said, let's get back to the video. Thanks, guys.
Again, I would say, and trying to analyze the Middle East and the different groups can be very challenging, and the mainstream media rarely reports things in a way that is accurate. When we noted, we used that topic as an opening for one of our pieces, because people were suitably distracted with these drone sightings and the death of that United Health CEO. Nobody really noticed that Turkey and the U.S. and Israel basically carved up Syria. I mean, Syria doesn't really exist anymore. Israel took a big chunk of it. Turkey took an even bigger chunk of it, and the U.S. is defending its share that it was already in possession of, which through its alliance mostly with the Kurds, the U.S. is in possession of Syrian oil. I can't really understand what's going on. I view the current government as a front for Turkey. I think Erdogan has ambitions to recreate the Turkish empire and is notorious for sensing weakness and pressing and even overpressing his leverage. It would be odd if the Turkish military and U.S.-backed Kurdish forces with U.S. soldiers there engaged in direct kinetic conflict. We're seeing reports of that, but not necessarily a full-scale invasion, let's say, by the Turkish military yet. But that would be odd. Two NATO members engaged, NATO members, like Turkey's a NATO member. We are under an Article 5 obligation to defend them in case their territory is militarily violated. To see a U.S. proxy battling a NATO military would be kind of odd, wouldn't it? So who knows? Again, another situation where I think it's just impossible for outsiders like us to have any real penetration into what's really going on behind the scenes.
What can we make of Turkey and Russia's relationship now? At face value, it appears that Turkey may have backstabbed Russia in the process, but Russia did move its ports over from their port in Tartus to I believe, to Libya. So what's the deal there between the two countries? Has there been a betrayal, or was this all part of an agreement from what you've been able to gather?
It's probably, again, total reiteration that I'm not an expert in this, just reading the news and trying to interpret it through our own mental models like everybody else. Putin and Erdogan have had a long history and a complex one. And I think that they probably understand each other, and Putin knows how Erdogan reacts. So he may have been surprised, but I think betrayed is probably too strong of a word. And I think the Russians haven't fled their bases yet. They still might. I occasionally read English language versions of interviews with important people in Russia to try to understand what they're saying to each other. And Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, just gave an interesting interview where he had some pretty balanced comments on the situation in Syria and blamed the sudden collapse, at least in part, on Assad's unwillingness to seek a meeting and overall an agreement with Erdogan. He also blamed U.S. sanctions as well. And so I think there's a bit of a, if we compare this sort of collapse to what happened in Afghanistan, for example, it's an entirely different scene, right? I mean, and so we shall see. Again, all this happened while everyone in the U.S. was looking up at the sky at drones, which is why I said earlier it may have been a psyop. But, the major redrawing of borders that will be, permanent, at least as measured in decades, occurred in days, which is how it often happens. The country of Syria, as we know it, doesn't really exist anymore. And that's a longstanding objective of the U.S. CIA. And so mission accomplished, I guess. To what end, I don't know, but that seems to be what the U.S. and Israel at least somewhat wanted.
Understood. You're starting to see some interesting happenings in the energy sector at the moment. And this may or may not be related to what's going on with Ukraine. It's to my understanding, a deal between Ukraine and Russia just expired that enabled natural gas to flow through Ukraine and into Europe. And is that the reason why we're seeing a 15 to 20% increase in the price of natural gas as of today? This is December 30th at the time of this recording.
So that's the situation I mentioned earlier between Slovakia and Ukraine, and Russia's deal passes through Ukraine, and they have not been able to reach an agreement on the transit rights. And so Russia has vowed that as of the end of the day tomorrow, I believe, they're just going to turn off the gas. The rally in natural gas is in the U.S. and has nothing to do with those events because, by and large, the natural gas markets are very regional. And I was actually surprised that landed LNG prices in Europe weren't up higher this morning on the news of those events. Must be priced in. But the reason why natural gas prices in the U.S. are spiking is because meteorologists were projecting a massive polar vortex to hit the country and perhaps set some record low temperatures here in the coming days and weeks. These weather forecasts are difficult and they swing prices pretty wildly, especially in the front month. And so Henry Hub natural gas spiked, I think, up to like 420 per million BTU today. It's since settled back down, but that is purely a weather event plus supply-demand dynamics in the U.S. Natural gas in Europe is and will be affected by what happens between Russia and Ukraine, but there too, front-month contracts are probably more determined by the weather. And so it must be that the weather patterns, although I have not looked, in Europe are not nearly as worrisome from a natural gas consumption perspective as what the short-term forecasting situation is in the U.S.
What do you forecast out for energy in 2025?
Our view is that, absent any major geopolitical events, which is always, can scramble things, oil is very well supplied, probably oversupplied. OPEC is diminishing in its influence over the markets with each passing day. It's doing all it can to protect the lower bound of $70 a barrel, which is sort of widely seen in the market as the price that OPEC would like. As natural gas prices continue to spike in the U.S., this, in a weird way, but we've been pointing this out for a long time, actually makes it easier for the U.S. to produce more oil because gas and oil are co-produced in many of the large shale regions, not all of them, but in particular the Permian Basin, for example, is practically constrained by co-production of natural gas. And if natural gas, which has more than doubled, is suddenly a valuable molecule, and we think because of the perfect fuel for the AI transition it will be, you will see increased drilling activity because now they not only have a place for the natural gas to go, but they're being compensated for it. So the very act by OPEC of elevating oil prices is inducing more drilling in the U.S., which is producing an avalanche of natural gas, which is now finding new demand uses for it, which the market always does, which is finally collapsing the generational arbitrage, which is literally the title of a piece we wrote in April, that oil to gas ratio is collapsing back to more historical norms from all-time highs in April when we wrote that piece. And the net effect of all of this in the long run is it's going to kneecap OPEC and bring oil prices down. So if you asked us today, this is the stance we've had all year. Bullish natural gas in the US, bearish oil globally. And we'll see once that oil to gas ratio potentially even reaches parity, which is something we predicted was possible a few months ago. We would sort of stay in that stance. But the more it comes back to historical levels, the less conviction we have in that stance. I should explain what I mean by oil to gas, by the way. There's about 5.8 million BTUs of energy in a barrel of oil. And so if you take the price of oil and divide it by the Henry Hub price of natural gas, that ratio should be 5.8. Historically, because natural gas is harder to handle, it's traded between 10 and 20. And when we wrote generational arbitrage back in April, that ratio had spiked up to 45 to 50. In other words, I think WTI was trading at 80, and natural gas was $1.80, $1.90, or maybe even slightly lower. Now, the rest of the year, oil has sort of slid down to this level. It's going to close the year, I think, either flat or slightly down on the year. And natural gas has been creeping up from $1.55 per million BTU at the lows to $4.20 today. And that ratio then has come back down to as low as 16 this morning, which is back in the middle of that historical range. If natural gas becomes the dominant fuel supplier to the AI boom, I think we could see the oil to gas ratio plunge below even 5.8, which is the energy equilibrium value. And in that world, then natural gas would be deemed more valuable than even oil.
When has that ever happened in history?
I don't think it actually has, at least not on the charts that I look at. Well, I mean, when oil went negative, everything kind of got messed up. But if I've got the chart pulled up, hasn't really happened outside of COVID in the last 5 years, and I'm just going to hit max and see what my Bloomberg machine tells me. It's a data intense chart, so it'll take a few seconds. But I don't think it's ever really happened as far as I can plot it. Maybe once, in 2000, it got below that temporarily. But who knows? 9/11 was around that time too. So, but yeah, it's for the vast majority of the time, natural gas has traded at a premium. At a discount to oil. Oil has traded at a premium because gas is hard to handle. It's a gas. You got to compress it. You got to ship it around. Oil is easier to handle. And so, as we're talking right now, the ratio is down to 18.3.
Gotcha. And then just broad forecast and what you expect from the second Trump term moving forward.
Well, I mean, I would encourage everybody listening to go and listen to some of his Agenda 47 videos, because he was very, very clear what his agenda will be. He's pro-energy. He is anti-immigration. That significant debate we saw on Twitter, again, as I mentioned earlier, was fascinating to watch. He wants to compete with China economically. I don't think he wants any new wars and would like to bring the existing wars to a stop, with one possible exception. He seems fixated on Iran for whatever reasons. And so we might see a reorienting of the theater of action away from Ukraine and towards Asia Pacific and Iran. But when he was campaigning, he would often take time to congratulate himself on the fact that he had no wars during his administration. And so, at least compared to the Biden administration's record, he would be considered a sort of a peacenik. That's the broad strokes. He wants pro-American jobs, high tariffs, close the borders, solve the fentanyl crisis. He wants to. So an interesting thing that we might write about. Been sort of trying to figure out what the peg for such a story would be, which is the thing you hang the article on. He's sort of, in our view, bringing back the Monroe Doctrine. Like if you just look at Greenland, Panama Canal, Canada, potentially even Cuba, I think there's a world where he disengages from Russia, do the minimum we need to do in the Middle East, reach some détente with China and then focus on the Western Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere is blessed with enormous resources. Like the US can still be the world's most powerful superpower, focusing inward, not necessarily in the sort of traditional isolationist sense, because Trump clearly, by his tweets, which I take quite literally, is not an isolationist. He wants Greenland to be part of the US. He would actually want Canada to be part of the US. He wants to take back the Panama Canal, and don't be surprised if we see military action to do it. And so I also think we'll see a sort of a reconciliation, or at least a lifting of these terrible sanctions against Cuba, which I think are a scandal. And so if we just concentrate on the Western Hemisphere, there's plenty to do here. I don't know why we need to go abroad in search of adventures.
What's the rationale behind making Canada a 51st state and buying Greenland? Is it simply the resources in Canada or what?
Well, I mean, it's probably more nuanced than that. But yeah, Canada is an exceptionally resource intense country with a very small population comparatively, a tenth of the population of the US to the nearest, order of magnitude. Greenland is blessed with well, not all, many of the critical resources that the US is now beholden to China to. Rare earth metals, you name it. Who knows what's really there if the US oil and gas sector were unleashed to do proper drilling and mapping. Canada has the second largest resource base in the world, depending on how you measure it. The oil sands out in Alberta and BC and so on, Saskatchewan. Enormous resources. They have unbelievable nuclear power technology. Quebec is one of the major hydropower producers in the world. Lumber, farmland, fertilizer, you name it. It's a wealthy country. Of course, Canadians, and many of them listening, would be appalled that we're talking so flippantly about their national sovereignty, but we shall see. Canada has its own political crisis unfolding, as I'm sure you know. But yeah, the benefit would be obvious. You get an enormous influx of resource. You get access to the Arctic, by the way, which is becoming more strategic. If you look at the globe, not with the North America in the center of it, but with the North Pole at the center of it, you suddenly realize the strategic importance of Greenland vis-a-vis Russia and Europe. I don't think that this is a joke. I don't think he's trolling. He has a way of negotiating, and perhaps sovereignty won't change, but agreements between entities might be rewritten in far more in America's favor. But I would take it very seriously. If I lived in those places, I would not think that Trump is joking.
Explain the significance of the North Pole strategically.
Well, that's just the way to look at the map. I think there's all manner of enormous natural resources all over the world where people have not really explored. This is this whole concept of peak cheap anything. The world isn't running out of anything, especially not hydrocarbons, and especially not natural gas. There's like way more of it for way longer than we could possibly need. Same thing with coal, uranium. And so when you look at where the largest deposits of unexplored resources are, those are tough places to extract from. As technology develops, and those resources could theoretically become reserves, because we now have the technology to economically exploit them, suddenly the playing field looks a little different. And I think we have a bit of an understandable focus on North America and then going left to right on the map, but going over the globe, which is how most planes fly when you go to Europe, for example. That's the shortest path, right? And so like the distances involved are much smaller than you would think looking at the traditional maps. And so there's a fight right now for the Arctic. Many claims, international boundary claims are notorious. They're the source of countless wars, and there's no reason why that would end. I think we're going to see battles over who gets to drill what and who gets to mine what where, in places where nobody ever thought was strategic.
Yeah, and by way of Canada, I mean Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal. I mean, these are all three big, huge Canadian cities that would be enveloped into the United States if it does happen.
But also that means the rest of Canada is even more sparsely populated, of course. As you know, like it's a vast expanse of territories with almost nobody living in them. Certainly not nobody. The people that live there care very much about it, but from a population density perspective, it's quite meager.
Would it be more advantageous to make Canada a territory as opposed to a state, or no?
Who knows what's going to happen? This is not something that's going to happen. Like I don't think that this is. I think Trump may want to have it happen. That's fascinating and interesting in and of itself. The odds of something meaningful actually happening, other than sort of renegotiating agreements between the countries on different terms, remains quite low in my view.
Gotcha. Well, Doomberg, anything else you want to talk about before we sign off here? I think we've covered pretty much everything I had lined up, but anything you want to bring up?
I just wanted to finish by congratulating you on all your success for 2024. It's been fun to watch you grow. Happy to have been a minor participant in that as a recurring guest. It's fun to see other content creators succeed like yourself. I wish you and your friends and family the very best. A happy new year and a fantastic 2025.
Well, thank you, Doomberg. I really do appreciate it. You were actually my second guest ever on the podcast, second or third, I can't remember, but you were one of the first 3 guests I had on the show back when I had like 200 or 300 subs. And yeah, you'll always be a guest here, my friend.
It's great to hear, and I would just say, really, congratulations, and it validates our policy that if any podcast host that is generous enough to have us on, we're more than happy to go on, and to see people like you succeed after having been an early guest is really heartwarming. So again, congratulations and all the success in 2025.
Thank you, sir. Where can people find you?
Yeah, doomberg.com. You'll find everything there. We have our articles, we have our pro tier webinars, we have our podcast appearances like this one. Doomberg.com. Danny, always great. Talk soon.
All right. See you, Doomberg. And if you guys enjoyed this show, remember to give us a like. It really does help us in boosting our video into the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss an episode. And if you want to help us monetarily, you can be a paying subscriber on our Substack, capitalcosm.substack.com. Link to that is down below, where you get access to all of my content early and ad-free before the YouTube audience. And then check out our partners over at Miles Franklin. Pick up some gold and silver, add to your stack. Email them info@milesfranklin.com and tell them that Capital Cosm sent you to get special deals on gold and silver that you won't find on their website. With all that said, I thank you guys for watching, and I thank you, Doomberg, for coming on, and I'll catch you in the next episode. Bye, y'all.